Welcome to what we hope will be the first in a series of annual programs to take stock of the U.S. tax system. I guess I should say I'm Len Berman. I'm the director of the Tax Policy Center. This year, the election is obviously the big news. We still have half a dozen viable candidates with interesting and varied tax plans. Next year, we'll be able to talk about the new president and what the election means for tax policy. We're already working on that analysis now. I would like to thank the Tax Policy Center Leadership Council for its financial support of the TPC, which makes events like this possible, and for the council chair, Bob Posen, for help in organizing this fantastic conference. He was a big, actually the big moving force behind it. I also want to thank Bill Gale, my co-director at Brookings, who did virtually all the work in putting this conference together. And Jesse DeZora, who actually, along with Blake Green and Chelsea Krim, did all of the, I said, well, Bill did all the work, like inviting people and things like that. But Jesse and Blake and Chelsea actually did the hard work that actually makes the conferences happen and seem like they're an easy thing to do, which they're not. This campaign has raised a number of fascinating, if controversial, tax policy issues. By stepping away from the political bombast, we have a great chance to elevate the tax policy debate. In your handouts, I think everybody should have a handout with a comparison of the candidates' plans with some graphs. Do people have that? We've released analyses so far of Rubio, Cruz, Trump, and Bush. Analyses of Clinton and Sanders are coming next week. We did them last in hopes that we'd actually see the whole Clinton plan, but it's still in the process of being released in installments, and so we will analyze what we had as of last week, or we have done that. The interesting thing is that two of the top three candidates would replace the income tax with a consumption-based tax system. This precipitated a fascinating internet debate between two giants of the economics field just Monday. On his blog, Harvard professor and TPC advisory board member Greg Mankiw chided Nobel laureate Paul Krugman for misrepresenting the incidence of Marco Rubio's X-tax proposal. So this is like nirvana for tax policy geeks. You just unpack that. Marco Rubio proposed an X-tax. It's a progressive variant of a value-added tax. They get mad when we say this, but it's actually true, that many economists favor because it doesn't penalize saving, but which has never been a presidential plank before. As a result, we're having a semi-public debate about economic incidence, a fundamental notion of public finance that the people who bear the burden of taxes may differ from the entities that write the checks to the IRS. It's why economists think that the amount employers pay in Social Security and Medicare taxes ultimately comes out of your paycheck. Krugman said that Rubio's X-tax exempts capital income from tax, and this is a quote, Mitt Romney would end up owing precisely zero in federal taxes. Mankiw shot back, quote, the Rubio plan is a progressive consumption tax. Anyone who consumes bears the burden of the tax, even if you don't send a check to the government. The incidence is actually more complicated than that since retail prices are unlikely to change, and my colleague Eric Toder and Joe Rosenberg have an excellent paper on the subject. But Mankiw's basic point is absolutely spot on. However, the question, of course, is can a tax where the idle rich don't have to write checks to the IRS be politically viable? I guess we'll find out. Rubio isn't the only candidate with a consumption-based tax. Ted Cruz has what he calls a business flat tax. Rubio says it's a VAT. Cruz says it's not. It's a VAT. Cruz's proposal is a textbook example of a subtraction method value-added tax. Again, tax policy geek land. It's very similar to a retail sales tax, but it's collected in stages. Cruz avoids the Krugman-Romney optics problem by imposing a 10% income tax in addition to his 19% VAT. This 19% VAT, he calls a 16% VAT because it's a tax-inclusive rate. And for the second part of this tax policy seminar, I'll explain what that means. But, and I know you'll all want to be my Facebook friends when I tell you that there's been an impassioned debate about the relative merits of Cruz's and Rubio's consumption taxes on my Facebook feed. The X tax has a couple of real advantages. It's designed to be more progressive because the tax rate on the wage portion doesn't have to match the flat VAT rate. And it will be more transparent to workers than a VAT because it will be deducted from their paychecks. The advantage of a VAT is that it's much easier to collect tax from a few million businesses than from 100 million plus individual tax filers. I'm not going to take sides, but I love that politicos and my Facebook friends are passionately debating which is the better implementation of a tax that we've never seen in this country before. And then there's Donald Trump. That was a laugh line. I'm sorry. I was not going to say that. Donald Trump's tax plan is something of an outlier. He lowers marginal tax rates like the other GOP frontrunners, but he retains the income tax. His tax rhetoric is unusual for a Republican in that he says he's going to go after the hedge funds and multinationals. Hedge funds and private equity funds would be taxed at ordinary rates on their carried interest in his plan rather than at lower capital gains rate as under current law. That's a proposal Barack Obama has made for years. Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders have it in their proposals. Multinationals will be taxed currently on their worldwide income. He'd eliminate the furrow. That's another actually fairly far left Democratic proposal. This sounds pretty hard-nosed and in line with Trump's populist rhetoric, but there's a catch, which is that business income would be taxed at a 15% rate, 10 percentage points below the top rate on wage income, and far less than under current law. The result, populist rhetoric aside, is that his plan would convey giant tax cuts for very high-income people like Donald Trump. You can see how all the GOP plans would affect the distribution of tax burdens in Figure 1, which is in your handout. The plans would all cut taxes across the board, but with the biggest cuts accruing to those with very high incomes. Cruz's plan is most skewed to the rich because he likes flat taxes, but Trump's plan would also give the top 1% tax cuts of over 15% of income. Rubio's plan is actually the least top-heavy of the GOP packages because of the progressive rates in his X tax, and also because he offers very large new child tax credits. The first version of Rubio's plan was co-sponsored with Senator Mike Lee of Utah, where they have big families. So is the change in the distribution a bad thing? Something else that's being debated. Supporters say that concentrating tax cuts within the top income ranks is only right because high-income people pay the highest rates, the highest taxes now, and cutting their high rates would spur growth. And critics point to the record high income inequality. Another fun debate. The budgetary implications of the GOP plans are also somewhat disconcerting, especially in light of already rising and unsustainable levels of public debt. And here I want to give a plug to a brand new paper by Alan Auerbach and Bill Gale, which shows that just under current law, the national debt is going to rise at just because of demographics, because of the tax cuts that were just passed and other factors, the debt is going to rise at an alarming rate, much faster than we had expected over the next 10 or 20 years. Before considering the effects of the Republican tax cut plans on the economy, they pile up $6.8 trillion to $9.5 trillion in deficits. Trump's is the biggest and Rubio's is the smallest. If you add interest costs, the plans would push debt held by the public to over 110% by 2026 and over 150% by 2036. That's Figure 2. The candidates would object that they plan to cut spending. Rubio and Cruz support a balanced budget amendment, but the cuts would have to be enormous and much bigger than anything we have seen in peacetime or than they have stipulated. None of the candidates seems inclined to cut defense, although Donald Trump, I think, thinks the Mexicans will pay for our national defense. And Donald Trump has promised not to touch Social Security or Medicare. So there's just not enough money in non-defense discretionary spending to make the numbers work. So that raises the question of what the effect of these plans on the economy would be. All of the GOP plans would cut marginal tax rates, and there are models, some of which have gotten a fair amount of prominence, in which just cutting marginal tax rates, cutting one of the charts, the third chart in your handout shows the marginal effective tax rate on new investment, and all of these plans would significantly cut it. What that means is that the that the tax burden on a new investment is lower than it would be under current law. And all else equal, that would encourage more investment. Rubio's plan is the best. Basically, it's a consumption tax, plus he keeps the research and experimentation credit, which makes for actually a negative effective tax rate on new investment. The other plans cut marginal effective tax rates, but not to zero. They cut it a lot for corporate investments. So these cuts in tax rates, all else equal, would result in a lot of new investment, which would boost growth. And some models basically just say that by improving the incentive to make new investment, that there'd be a surge of new investment, people would work harder, all of these things would contribute to a larger economy, and those would produce positive feedbacks. When income goes up, there's more income to tax revenues go up. There's a large caveat, and the caveat is that if spending can't be radically trimmed, then all of the additional government borrowing would push up interest rates and could even precipitate a debt crisis. If you're thinking about debt levels of 150% of GDP, even in the United States, the richest country in history, people might become a little nervous about lending. If those push up interest rates, that actually makes the debt problem worse, makes us a worse risk for foreign investors, and there are situations in which that could create a spiral where we would not be able to finance additional borrowing at all. But even if that doesn't happen, Bill Gale has a paper with Peter Orzag. We surveyed a lot of past evidence, and he found that there's a connection between the structural deficit, the difference between what the government brings in and what it's paying for current services, and interest rates. And if that connection holds in the future, then interest rates would go up. And we did some calculations that I'll write up soon, or we will release after we finished all the candidates' analyses, that shows that the interest rate increase would offset the effects of the lower marginal tax rate on new investment, so that in net, there'd be less of an incentive for businesses to invest. Higher interest rates are bad for business investment. They're bad for purchasing homes and things like that. So in that scenario, the dynamic score could result in a bigger deficit than our so-called static estimates. The Democrats also raise a host of tax and budget policy issues. Bernie Sanders proposes a new financial transaction tax and a carbon tax, things we've never seen before in this country, and no one else has wanted to propose. He'd sharply increase marginal income tax rates on high-income filers to finance very expansive social safety net proposals. By this year's standard, Hillary Clinton is being positively modest, at least so far. She, too, has some interesting new proposals, but none would be surprising additions to an Obama budget, and many are actually carryovers. While the Republicans cut taxes for almost everyone, and Clinton promises to hold couples earning under $250,000 harmless, Sanders unabashedly raises taxes on everyone. The big tax increases in both Dems' plans fall on those with high incomes. Hillary's plan looks relatively fiscally responsible, although she says she still has campaign proposals coming, whereas Sanders would raise trillions, but all or more than all of it is earmarked to pay for new spending. As for the economic effects, the Democratic plans would also tend to impose a drag on the economy by raising marginal tax rates, basically the reverse of what we're talking about in the context of the Republican plans. And in the case of Sanders, it really is just a flip side. You're going from giant tax cuts to a really giant tax increase. The Democrats would object that their taxes are financing new investments that would boost the economy in the long run. That is, they also want a dynamic score, but of the magical economic benefits of spending programs designed by omniscient social planners, which always work out well. So the election offers lots of choices and lots of wishful thinking and lots of teachable moments. With that, I'd like to introduce Washington Post columnist Ruth Marcus, a Pulitzer Prize finalist who cares about tax and budget policy and writes about it with a clarity and grace that I envy. Ruth will introduce our first panel. Thanks.
Get there. Okay, thanks. Great. Hi, good morning. Len, I don't think I've ever heard a sentence before with the words tax and grace in it together, so thank you very much for that. I come to you not quite hot off the campaign trail because I skipped South Carolina, but I really don't want to burst your bubble here, but the campaign trail is not actually consumed with discussion about the relative merits of the X tax and the subtraction method. And actually one thing that we can get to that's really striking is the disconnect between the size of the tax proposals on the campaign trail and the absence of actual discussion of them, including by the candidates themselves who are proposing them. But let me start by introducing everybody who knows much more about that than I do. Bill Hoagland is the Senior Vice President of the Bipartisan Policy Center, which an oasis of bipartisanship in this crazy town we live in. Bill spent 33 years in the federal government, including 25 years on the Senate staff, Director of Budget and Appropriations in the Office of Majority Leader Frist, and when we first met, staff director of the Senate Budget Committee, taught me everything I then needed to know about what was going on in the budget. Heather Boucher is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and executive director and chief economist at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Jared Bernstein is a senior fellow at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, and from 2009 to 2011 was the chief economist and economic advisor to Vice President Biden and executive director of the White House Task Force on the Middle Class, which, as we know, is what tax policy is all about, if you listen to the folks on the campaign trail. And finally, Alex Brill, research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Before that, policy director and chief economist at the House Ways and Means Committee, previously on the staff of CEA, and near and dear to my heart, on the staff of the late lamented Simpson-Bowles Commission. So I thought we would get started as I was taught to start when I first began writing about budget and taxes longer ago than I think I want to admit right now, is with the baseline. And that baseline here being how the tax policies, how this campaign is different from other campaigns, how the tax policies that these candidates are presenting are in line with what we've seen in previous campaigns and the discussion is in line, or how they are vastly different. And so since you've seen more than others on this stage, Bill, I thought I'd start with you.
Oh, dear.
How is this campaign different from other campaigns?
This campaign?
Yes.
This campaign.
When it comes to tax.
Well, of course, the decision that was made at the end of the last Congress to extend the number of the expiring tax provisions makes a whole lot of difference in terms of how meeting particular targets going forward in tax reductions, and extending, making permanent the R&D tax credit and a number of the other tax credits makes it a lot easier. The difficulty is that the deficit, as Lynn is talking about, at least measured in terms of, since those tax extenders were not offset, it means that the getting to balance, if the Republican candidates still believe in getting to balance, if they still believe in that, it makes it extremely difficult in a 10-year window, as the House Budget Committee is finding out right now, and the Senate Budget Committee is finding. It makes it extremely difficult to find a way to get to a balanced budget in 10 years. The deficit for 2025 and 10 years out, compared to a year ago, in that year alone is nearly $200 billion higher than it was a year ago. And yet that's the year in which most people say we got to get to balance.
Jared, from your perspective, how is this? How do the tax
How
proposals?
does this night differ from
campaign?
all other nights?
Yes, exactly. Thank you for
it's a
getting
good question
that,
for me,
my little
yeah.
analogy there. I didn't think anybody in this room would get it.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you. I think there are similarities and differences, and they're quite interesting. I think they're on the Republican side, I see broad similarities between what's being proposed and what we've seen, say, in Mitt Romney, or for that matter, in the Ryan budgets, where you have very large, high-end tax cuts, allegedly offset by spending cuts that tend to be a pretty magic asterisk. And if you do the math that Len suggested, awfully hard to see how you get there once you take so much off the table. So the numbers tend not to add up, and in my view, and I think Len corroborated this, in my view, that's a problem. However, I don't think we've seen consumption taxes to this extent in at least recent campaign proposals, so that's a bit new. And of course, on the Democrat side, we have another similarity and a difference that are interesting. Secretary Clinton's pledge not to raise taxes on anyone on joint filers below 250,000. That's something that's been around for a while. It's something I'm quite critical of, by the way. I think that's an unfortunate pledge. By the way, people may not know this, but the percent of household income above 250,000 is 3. So basically, you're saying I will only raise taxes on the top 3%. The other side's basically saying I won't raise taxes on anyone. That leads to a very cramped debate. Of course, the other piece of this that's different is the Bernie Sanders plan, which is actually quite radically different from what we've seen in the past.
Right. Feel free to answer the previous question, even as I ask the next one. But this is for Heather and Alex, which it doesn't have to do with baseline. It has to do with relevance. In other words, should we really, thank goodness for the Tax Policy Center and the work that it does in analyzing these plans and giving us both bottom line costs and distributional effects, because it brings a granularity to an otherwise incredibly fuzzy debate. However, that said, given the unlikelihood of, in this climate, both this political climate and this fiscal climate, of the candidates' tax plans being enacted, should we really be kind of focusing in on the precision, on the precise elements of what they're proposing, or is this, should we all go home and have another cup of coffee? Heather?
Well, let me try both questions at once, because I think both of them are interesting. I think that Bill and Jared made a number of points about the baseline, but one of the things that does feel different, I think it's both the Bernie Sanders and the Donald Trump phenomena that are pushing a different, there are some elements that they're playing against type that I think is really important to elevate in this conversation, which I actually think gets to your question of relevance. So, you have this population out there in America that they're trying to reach who, we've had recovery for many, many years now, but yet families aren't feeling it, so they're trying to address this economic anxiety. I found it quite striking when you look at this chart, and thank you for putting this into a nice color chart for us. When you look at Trump, that he's actually gonna, he's actually gonna increase after-tax income for the middle quintile slightly more than his colleagues. He's willing to go after the hedge fund people. He's kind of taking some of these Democratic pieces into his argument that is different. We haven't seen that on the Republican side, at least in the elections that I've followed. So I think that is different. And then, of course, Bernie being so willing to say, I'm going to just raise taxes a whole bunch, and I'm going to cut how much you're going to spend on things. And that's I think most of us are trying to wrap our heads around, okay, wait, could you actually do that? And if so, what would that really look like? So they're putting a new idea out there to think about, which I think it's, to go into your question around relevance, I think I have 3 thoughts on this. One, when you sit down and look at these tax plans, especially the way that the Tax Policy Center has done so nicely on the Republican side, it's just so easy to see how disconnected this set of ideas is from the other discussions that we have here in Washington all the time about fiscal responsibility and budgets. Just that massive disconnect that is not getting through to voters, I think, in any way, shape, or form is one question of relevance. Like, once they get here, what are we actually going to be talking about if one of the Republicans were to win? But then second, the disconnect between the spending side, like all the things that we need to be doing. For something else I was thinking about yesterday, I was sort of re-remembering that, we've cut so many jobs at the state and local level in education over the course of the recovery. And, if you sort of listen to the campaign, so many people are really concerned about education, K through 12, 0 through 5, college. So how are we going to reconcile these two big things? It seems there's a lack of relevance on that as well. Setting aside the tax debates, it seems totally disconnected from the other economic debates we're having.
And Alex.
Thank you. I think it is a relevant issue, but I think it's, despite the fact that it's not the sort of the primary issues that we hear about in the debate, but I think it's important also not to view the candidates' tax plans as binary choices, all or nothing. It is perhaps in a political sense because it tells us about what they, philosophically believe to some extent, but given both the large revenue loss from the Republican plans and the contrast between the size of those tax plans together, whether it's 6 trillion or 12 trillion, or either way, and what we're hearing in Washington, just as Heather said, there is a disconnect. Republicans here in Washington have a very different perspective on the baseline question, right? When I had the opportunity to work with the Simpson-Bowles Commission, the divide between Republicans and Democrats was not over raising taxes or cutting taxes. It was over raising taxes versus holding taxes constant. And if you look at recent budget proposals here in Washington, they're generally revenue neutral, right? And so that's a very different baseline perspective. Now, there are similarities, I think, between what the candidates are talking about, both among the candidates on the Republican side, and what Republican leaders in Washington are talking about. And they are talking about lower marginal tax rates. They're talking about maintaining a progressive tax system generally, most of them are, although maybe adjusting that progressivity. And they're talking about lowering the marginal rates on both on investment, and I think that the candidates are focused on a concern, Heather just mentioned it, a concern about what's happening in the middle class. And so we see a lot of middle class tax relief on the campaign trail on the Republican side. And you hear, if you compare that to what you hear in Washington right now, or what you heard yesterday in the Ways and Means Committee, it's a very different discussion. And so there is a disconnect, and that raises some of these questions, both the baseline
Can I
and the
respond
relevance.
to Alex? Because I think a lot of that makes sense, but a big chunk of it doesn't resonate with me in the following sense. And I feel like you may, I sometimes encounter people who I feel have overlearned the lessons of Simpson-Bowles, and that's what I feel I may have just heard a bit in there, but you can correct me if you disagree. So, Simpson-Bowles was not supported by the members of the commission, and one person who voted against it, a pretty important Republican right now, is Paul Ryan. And Paul Ryan viewed, as I understand, you know better than I probably, that the tax increases in Simpson-Bowles were unacceptable. And if you look at Paul Ryan's budget, as I said earlier, it's actually a lot closer to the kinds of tax proposals we see on the campaign trail. Perhaps not as egregious as some, but very much in that same spirit. Very much, by the way, what he and Mitt Romney ran on. Furthermore, I recently testified at the Ways and Means Committee. I know Kevin Brady is going to be here. And that testimony was very energized around the idea of cutting taxes to generate growth. So my view is that there is a kind of at least the center right, or certainly the far right, in Washington tax politics is closer to where the Republicans on the campaign trail are than you think they are. I'm not saying I'm right and you're wrong, but that's just a different perception.
So we've talked about that pesky little deficit thing, and I feel like in previous campaign cycles, that's kind of been an issue that people have addressed. And back in 2000, George W. Bush ran on the notion that he was going to, it was obviously a different deficit situation, or at least purportedly a different deficit situation. He was going to give the surplus that the tax authorities had taken from the American people back to the American people, and Al Gore was going to put some of it in a lockbox. As recently as 2012, Mitt Romney's tax plan was assertedly deficit neutral. Is 2016 just a kind of different animal where deficits don't matter anymore in terms of throwing out tax policy? I'm going to throw it open to anybody who wants to address that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why it's important in part to disaggregate these proposals. And so we can say that, you know, the wish list of policies that have been talked about on the campaign trail dig big holes in the deficit. I think on the Republican side, it's undeniably true, all right? I think the question is if one of those candidates becomes president and the legislative process begins, what might we expect? In part, that question relies on the answer to the question, what will the president's first priority be tax-wise? No president gets their entire agenda, and what is the rest of Congress thinking about what to do? So, what would given a modest, say, $1 trillion or $2 trillion tax cut? I say modest jokingly. What would that look like from any of these candidates? Because some of the good work that TPC and others have done has started to disaggregate, and I think that there are proposals within those tax platforms that affect marginal rates, that affect investment, that provide relief to the middle class, and mixing those things up. Some affect on the margin, some don't, and I think it's important to disaggregate that.
Bill,
I want to go back, kind of tie this to your first question. There is a real disconnect out there, and quite frankly, I'm beginning to wonder whether or not policy really makes an issue on the campaign trail.
That was kind of occurring to me.
It's more personalities than it is policy, it seems to me, and differences from fact. But I want to go back, and Lynn had raised this issue, and Jared's raised this issue. Being a budgeteer, I went back and just did a little calculation. And over the next 10 years, we will spend somewhere in the neighborhood of about $46 trillion, and that's on the discretionary side, and that's on the mandatory side. And I look at I'm a Republican. I look at the Republican proposals out there, and I add them up to get, they'll still say, we want to get to balance. We want to get to balance. To get to balance and have tax cuts anywhere in the neighborhood of 10 trillion or 13 trillion, that would mean you'd have to reduce all spending nearly 50% over the next 10 years. Or if you're going to separate out and let defense go up and leave the discretionary, you'd have to cut all the mandatory, and let's be clear what we're talking about, Medicare and Social Security and Medicaid, you'd have to cut it 2/3 to get to balance by the year 2025. There is such a disconnect here that I can't believe it. And quite frankly, earlier this week, another think tank in town, the Heritage Foundation, came out with a proposal to get to balance, and guess what? It had a $1 trillion tax cut, not a $13 trillion tax cut. And for the conservative Heritage to be saying the best we can do, of course, they also had $10 trillion in tax and spending cuts to go along with it. This is just unbelievable.
So, go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, so on this deficit question and on the campaign trail, I mean, so just to take it out a little bit out of the Washington, right? So these candidates are supposedly, they're out there talking to real people, right? They're trying to connect with what they think voters want to hear. And I think, so when you think about what people have lived through over the past 10 or 15 years, right? This build up to the financial crisis that, quite frankly, most of real America, myself included, many days don't quite understand like why that happened and what we could have done about it. The sense that we've been talking about deficits for 15 years now, and Washington keeps saying we're going to do something about it, but it doesn't. And these numbers are just, they're all sort of big and confusing to people anyway. But I wonder how much of this is that, after the Great Recession, the American public and workers and their families needed a set of economic policies that would get people back to work. We know that we've been successful in some ways, but we haven't gotten back to where we were in 2007. And what I see in this economic conversation is people focusing a lot on those kinds of issues. You certainly hear that on the Democratic side, rather than the role specifically about taxes in that piece of the puzzle. I think that some of the deficit stuff, I think it's sort of going over voters' heads, and so they're trying to focus on other aspects of it. I can't explain what the Republicans are doing, but it does seem that you hear them wanting to talk more.
Trying to get votes.
I think
they're trying to get votes.
I mean, I think this is, a lot of what you're hearing, in my view, is way too alarmist, and I'm nervous about it too. I share some of Bill's anxiety, but you know, the deficit was 10% of GDP at the height of the Great Recession. It came down to 2.5%. We were in primary balance. We stabilized the debt as a share of GDP at an unacceptably high level, but it was stabilized. And it actually would have remained stabilized if they hadn't gone and passed $700 billion of unpaid for tax cuts, which I argue was a mistake. However, we do have, I think, time to implement some of the kinds of policies that we could talk about. Some of them are in the president's budget, in my view. I see very few of them in the campaign proposals. But this idea that when you talk about 46 trillion, and to me that's kind of a fear number. I mean that's probably 23% of GDP or something. Now that's a couple of percentage points higher in terms of outlays than the historical average. That's not nothing, and it's something we have to deal with, and I think we could deal with. But the idea that deficits are, this terrifying force, especially in the midst of the inequality problems that Heather's described, is somewhat of distraction, and I share the American people's view on that.
Bill?
I just wanted to say, Jerry, I agree with you that this is not necessary to have this kind of debate, except for the fact that wouldn't you agree that a $14 trillion in unpaid for tax cuts is not good?
Yes.
Okay.
So I want to, all right. So now that we've had the fist bumping, I actually want to continue with the therapeutic role of this panel, which is, Bill talked about the disconnect. And one of the, I suspect that some of the people in this room and some of the people on this panel have had the experience of yelling at their television sets while
Never.
watching, well, I have, while watching debate moderators ask questions. So I want to empower each of you pretty briefly to be a debate questioner, but it's going to be, I want you to ask the debate question of somebody who you would be more apt to be ideologically aligned with. And Jared, I'm going to start with you because you said something critical about Secretary Clinton and her $250,000 proposal. So what I'd like to hear from each of you is your best tax policy question to an individual candidate based on his or her plan.
Okay.
And then we can assume the response, which will be one version of waste, fraud, and abuse, get rid of special interest loopholes, or cut wasteful spending, or something else. And so sort of not just what the question is, but the question for
in my case, for
candidate.
HRC.
Yes. Question for the candidate, and then how do you, what's the follow-up question?
Okay, that's a great, I'd love to try that. So first of all, let me be very clear. I think I'm a big admirer of Secretary Clinton and have long been so. And my critique is about the pledge. And by the way, let me remind you that when President Obama made his pledge, I won't raise taxes above $250,000, in the hurly-burly of the tax debate, that quickly became $450,000. That means that 99.5% of the income distribution is left out. I think that I would say it is, based on some of the numbers that Len cited earlier, Secretary Clinton, it seems inevitable that even revenue-neutral tax policy, which is what I have generally think I've heard you talk about, meaning that when you've raised taxes, it's to pay for something, won't be enough. Simply demographics alone, not to mention threats that I know you, Secretary Clinton, recognize, threats of climate, threats of poverty, threats of insufficient infrastructure investment in children. So we're going to have to raise more revenues, aren't we? That would be my question.
And her response will be, are you serious? We're in a campaign, right?
So, exactly. So
yes,
that would be her
exactly.
response. And I would say that's
some nicer version of that.
And I would say, I understand, I'm not running for president. You are, so I apologize. But I still say, how are we going? So that's right. That would be my follow-up. I'm not, I wouldn't be good at it. I'm just saying what I would do.
Alex, what is your question? And the other response, that traditional response from Republican candidate that I left out of my waste, fraud, and abuse litany before is magic economic growth.
Sure.
So pick your Republican target there and go at them.
Sure, I'm torn. I mean, on one hand,
You can have two. Really
yeah.
quickly,
So my first one is a very short one, which is, tell me again why it's not a VAT. Because
I see televisions across America just clicking off.
Changing their-
yeah, that's right. That's right. But we'd stay watching, right?
Yeah.
But you know, as Len talked about with Senator Cruz's plan, I think that debate is sort of distracted from a debate about tax policy. We've got a big debate going about nomenclature and instead of real substance. But I think I sort of telegraphed where my question would be earlier, when I think it's important to look within the tax plans and not look at them in a binary sense. And so the question that I would pose to the candidates is, given a budget constraint, not a budget neutral agenda requirement, but given the constraint of only $2 trillion of tax cuts or some number like that, what would be in your tax plan?
That's an interesting question. I guess the answer on a debate stage would be getting back to you on that.
Yeah, yeah.
How would you get them to sort of be, in a instantaneous way to make those, give them the sets of choices that they would be facing?
So I mean, I think you might motivate it by saying, just as others up here have said, that there's been a big, and the candidates themselves have said, there is a struggle in the middle class. People have not seen the kind of wage growth that they've been accustomed to in the past, and there's a lot of economic anxiety in the middle of America. At the same time, we have, on the sort of from a different perspective, the worst corporate tax code of all the corporate tax codes in the world, and one that's really hindering the growth and the ability of our multinationals to expand and compete in a global environment. If you can't provide tax relief on both sides, which one, what are you going to do? What are you going to do first? Or what are you going to do first, right? I mean, where are the priorities? I think it's important because as we look at plans like the Rubio plan, which has, I think, a lot of appealing characteristics, aside from the budget aspect.
Other than that.
Which is the big one, right? And so, as Len said, talking about the expanded child credit, the additional child credit, I mean, it has a lot of popular appeal. And is that his first priority if he had to pick? Or is it some of the reforms that drive down the marginal effective tax rate on new investment?
All right, I think actually the first two questions have been excellent questions, which just ramps up the pressure on you, Heather. You could ask Secretary Clinton a question if you want, but I'd love to hear one for Senator Sanders as well.
Yeah, gosh, that seems tough. So I think, for Sanders, I think that the big question that I have for Senator Sanders is around his, and I am just, this is why I'm not a journalist, because this is like a hard thing, like coming up with the right question. But the big question I have for him is around his healthcare proposal. And as I sort of mentioned a little bit earlier, what he's asking us to consider is that by increasing taxes to pay for this new plan, we're going to see all these reductions in family expenditures and private expenditures. I think my fundamental question, though, isn't actually about the taxes, but about all of the social change that is embedded in this, which actually gets to what, if I were to ask any question, I think, which is actually for all of them, a deeper question, which is that all of this sort of presumes that taxes is really our most potent economic tool, and it's just one of our tools. And so as we're thinking about either healthcare or how to address inequality, is thinking about the tax system the first place that we should be starting, or, and now I'm asking two questions, like if we're thinking about inequality, should we be thinking about other issues like, say, antitrust enforcement? Would that be a better focal point of government resources rather than thinking about just taxing the rich? That's a conversation that I'd like to see happening. So those are two. So one is, are taxes the solution to every problem? And I want to hear really more about how you're going to actually do this healthcare thing, if I were to ask Bernie Sanders one.
I like the way you phrase that. Bill?
My first thought is I want to ask all I'll take the Republicans,
Please.
okay? I want to ask you, did they take math in high school? But
Donald Trump wants you to know he was a very, very good student, and he has an uncle that was a professor at MIT.
yeah.
Next question.
Then, very simple, very straightforward, no surprise coming, that we've already touched on. Mr. Trump, do deficits and debt matter? And he'll say, sure they do. And then the follow-up question is, should we have a balanced budget? And he'll say, absolutely. And then the next simple question is, then how are you going to pay for $13 trillion in tax cuts over the next 10 years?
So you know what
Simple.
the answer to that question is?
What is it?
Growth?
It's actually
Growth.
multiple.
It'll be great.
It's going to be.
It'll be great.
I'm a good manager. I love that I'm playing Donald Trump. B, I'm a really good manager. There's massive waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. You see it all the time. Look at the cost of that hammer. And number 3, massive, massive economic growth. I'm going to make America great again. I'm going to be tough on China, and I'm going to bring those jobs back home.
And then the follow-up question will be, Mr. Trump, you are not you're being elected to be president of the United States. You're not being elected to be a king.
Great deal maker.
King. You're going to have to work with a Congress. You're going to have to work with a Senate. And the Senate is probably not going to have a 60 majority vote. How are you going to do all this? You've made all these great promises.
Have you read my book, The Art of the Deal? It's the best. It's the best-selling book short of the Bible. I love the Bible.
You do a good Trump.
I love the Bible. She's very good.
Good Trump.
These two
Trump better than Trump.
Corinthians walked into a bar.
And I think we've now demonstrated why we shouldn't be cruel and critical of my colleagues, because it really is hard
Yes.
to get these guys pinned down.
John Harwood
Yeah.
found out, yes.
Yeah. I have no good segue on this, so I'm just going to...
I'll stop.
One of the interesting things and the hardest thing to talk about, because it's so difficult for people to wrap their head around in the tax debate, has to do with corporate tax policy, which several of you have mentioned. From the Democratic candidates, talk about the problem of inversions and companies shipping jobs overseas and how we need to change the tax code to stop that. The Republican candidates put a lot of emphasis on the horror of our current high corporate tax rates and the degree of wealth that's trapped back home. Since I'm playing Donald Trump on the Tax Policy Center panel, he says it's not, I love this, he says it's not 2.5 trillion, that's other people's estimates, he says it's 5 trillion. So we get a little bit of extra revenue that way too, by the way, when I'm president. Talk a little, I'm going to just throw this open in a very open-ended way. These are two very different approaches to talking about corporate tax policy, but they share the sense that our corporate tax policy is super messed up, which I think is the technical term. Anybody who would like to kind of jump in and talk about what they find that's interesting, intriguing, infuriating, pick your poison, in what the candidates are talking about in that zone.
I'll start because I've thought a lot about this. I learned a pretty important Washington lesson on how people really actually, as opposed to what they say, where they actually are at on the desire to reform the corporate tax code when Dave Camp dropped a pretty, I thought, thoughtful piece of tax legislation, and it was drop-kicked in a New York Minute out the window by his Republican colleagues. This had a corporate tax reform that looked actually quite a bit like the one the president has. He went to 20, Camp went to 25, the president goes to 28. That's spitting distance in this world. And I think the problem is that when people talk about everybody wants to lower the rate and broaden the base, the politicians actually agree. It's all the lobbyists whom value those base broadeners as, we think they're inefficient waste. They think they're treasure job creation programs. So I think that the debate has been somewhat misrepresented in D.C. because everybody seems to say they want to do it, but when it actually comes to doing something, the entrenched interests block you. The one point I'll make about the candidates is Donald Trump does something that's really interesting and, in my view, extremely distortionary of the tax code. The TPC identifies this, but they didn't push it very far. This is not a critique. I think they made a legitimate choice not to do so. He basically makes, one of the problems with business taxing business income these days is the increase in pass-throughs. The share of business incomes moving into the individual side of the code now has gone from something like 20% 30 years ago to something like 50% now. I think there are TPC people in the room who know that number better than mine, but that's certainly the general trend. Donald Trump says the top rate on income under Trump's plan is 25%, but for pass-throughs it's 15%. That's the top rate. I mean, I like paying taxes, and I would incorporate tomorrow because the incentive is huge. Now, the TPC decided not to make the assumption that everybody's going to self-incorporate. If they did, the numbers would have looked even worse. So I think that's a huge distortion going out to happen.
And, you know, I want to say something about this because Len and I have talked about this, and I've written about the Trump plan. And one of the real restrictions on the capacity to translate candidates' plans into the public is actually illustrated by this provision, because I've probably in 2 or 3 columns written a chunk of maybe 100 words about that distortionary effect, and I always have to cut it from the column because for lack of space, and it's just illustrative of how hard it is to translate tax policy to serious tax discussion. Alex or Bill, did you guys want to talk about the corporate
Go ahead, Alex.
issue at all?
I mean, a couple thoughts. You know, in my view, and I may disagree with some of my colleagues up here, of all the taxes that we have today, the corporate one is the one that's causing the most harm and the most distortion and deserves the most attention for reform. We have a question about how to do that from a budget perspective. If we're talking about rearranging the deck chairs in a budget-neutral corporate approach, so it's both budget neutral and all the revenues are supposed to stay within the from the corporate income tax. In my view, it's difficult, if not impossible, to get ahead under that constraint. And what I mean by that is it's very difficult to lower effective marginal tax rates on new investment in a budget neutral, if you impose that budget neutral constraint on the corporate tax. There are ways around it. You could look for revenues from other places, or you could deficit finance that change. But if you're just trying to broaden the base and lower the rates, if you do the math, it's hard to get a change on the margin. But I do think that our corporate code sticks out among all our competitors, and it is to the detriment of our economy.
I want to go back to the kind of your opening question about disconnects. These are tax experts. I'm not a tax expert. But I think the difficulty we have with talking about corporate tax reform, which I agree needs to be done, the inversions is an issue. Try to buy an American beer. The only one, Samuel Adams in Boston, and he's holding out, and he's being told to go to Ireland. Can you imagine Samuel Adams coming out of Ireland? But anyway, the point I want to make is that the campaign out there is a populist campaign. It's about me. It's about my tax. To have a discussion about changing corporate tax rates without changing mine is, you get the pitchforks are coming to Washington if that's the case. So how do you tie corporate tax reform to individual tax reform with the pass-throughs? No wonder you have your 100 words are taken out every time. It is extremely difficult. I'd like to hear what Mr. Brady has to say, what Mr. Wyden has to say later today, because can you do international without getting into individual? I'd like to think you could, but I don't think, given the campaign out there, the populism will allow for that to take place.
So you can answer any question you want after I ask the question.
Okay, no, I wanted to add
which is
something,
like
yeah.
what I've learned doing TV panels. But I want to save some time for questions, but throw out one really last kind of lightning round one. One policy, since this has been a kind of Debbie Downer discussion, one policy that you like the best in all of the candidates' tax plans that you think merits further discussion. So Heather, you go first and say what you wanted to say also.
No, I just wanted to tap into this conversation about corporate and just note, and tap into, I think, something that Bill just said. I mean, on the one hand, you have people who want to do something about inversions, want to do something about all these companies that we read about in the paper every day who are, having all their profits overseas, or they're doing these ways of avoiding taxation here in the United States. And on the other hand, you have all this fear about if we tax them, then they won't create jobs. And so that also seems a really difficult place to be having this conversation out on the campaign trail, because it is also about fear mongering as well, I think. One policy. So something that I've worked on, has not been talked about at all up here today, which is sort of out of the general tax thing, but Sanders has signed on to the Family Act, which is about giving every worker in the United States access to paid family medical leave. And he's proposed doing that by raising a very small, or he signed on to legislation that's already in the House and the Senate, which would raise payroll taxes in a very small way. So we haven't talked at all about payroll taxes and the role of that in social insurance and providing protection for people. So that's one policy that I'd like us to hear more about.
Okay, great. Alex,
The question was...
what's your
Favorite policy?
Pick your favorite policy.
I think it's very interesting how, so again, budget aside, how radical the reforms are. I guess budget inclusive, I guess we should say. The debate has been quite radical, and a lot of discussion about transformation of the tax code. And in particular, I would note policy that I've supported in the past, which is the movement from a progressive income tax to a progressive consumption tax. I think that's a policy that has a lot of merit because it separates this question of income versus consumption versus from the progressive debate about a flat tax versus a progressive tax.
Great, Jared, you want the progressive consumption tax?
I'd rather say one thing I like on the Republican side and one thing I like on the Democratic side. And I've been very critical, as we all have. As we all have, about the holes in these Republican budgets. But interestingly, a number of them have gone after some wasteful tax expenditures in ways that I think are useful and important. And Trump, I believe, wants to end the deductibility of interest, which it creates a real distortion such that debt financing actually faces a negative tax rate. And if you think about a country with a negative tax rate on debt financing, that would be a country that would get over-leveraged, and then, in fact, that's exactly what we've done. So that's a neat idea on their side. On the Democratic side, an idea that I quite like is this financial transaction tax. I wouldn't go nearly up to 50 basis points on stocks as Bernie does. I'd probably start at 1 basis point. But I think it's a good idea, both in a Pigovian sense, in terms of kind of shutting down some of this distortionary noise trading, but also you can raise serious revenue off of a large notional base. The TBC did an excellent piece on this, by the way, if I can put in a plug for it.
And Bill?
My mother brought me up, if you have nothing nice to say about anything, don't say anything. But I guess to your question, I'm old enough to have been in this town and gone through with previous bosses something called the USA tax. Which was a non-diminutive proposal, and it was a form of a VAT tax, a consumption tax. I like the element that's in some of these plans that have to do with refocusing on consumption, and I know it's a difficult one, but then increasing savings. I think savings are critical here. So that's and I agree with Jared. I think there's the financial transaction tax. I don't know. I wouldn't go as far as Senator Sanders, but I do think there's an element there that needs to be looked at.
That's great to hear.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, on that cheery, fist-bumping note, let's open it up for questions, and we'll start up here with Bob Posen.
One of the things that
Just wait for the mic. Thanks.
one of the things that Donald Trump might say to defend his tax plan, beside Ruth, what you said, was dynamic scoring. In other words, that he would say, somebody said it more generally, he'll produce so much economic growth. So I wonder whether the panel could comment on what range of incremental growth is realistic. I mean, if you were to justify these huge tax cuts, you'd have to have huge economic growth in order to put that together. But should we be realistically saying if you did dynamic scoring, you talk about 10% economic growth change or 25% or 50%? Just ranges to see how far off this argument is.
Did you want to take that,
I'll start.
Alex?
I mean, I think Len was absolutely right when he teed this up, and we need to answer that question in the context of understanding what the financing would be for these proposals. And so if these proposals were married with contemporaneous spending reductions, and so that they were, if not revenue neutral, were deficit neutral, that's a tall task. I'm not suggesting it's not, but I think we could expect economic growth as a result of that because the marginal rates are coming down. Not 10, not 25, and not 50 certainly, less, but meaningful economic growth. But as Len described, in the absence of offsetting financing, much, if not all of that, could be mitigated. I'd also note on the scoring front, to distinguish between the dynamic issues, which I believe are true and important, and the general uncertainty and variation even within the conventional system. So these numbers that the government puts out or a think tank puts out are estimates, and there should be confidence intervals around these. And so we don't know whose plan is the most expensive. We know that they cost money, and a lot of it, right? But we don't know with the sort of precision either that the Budget Act of '74 requires, or the sort of precision that we're seeing in some of the non-governmental estimates, exactly how much any of these policies are going to cost. And that's true whether you're considering growth or not.
Well, a certain candidate that we are no longer hearing from talked about 4% economic growth. Does anybody? And the estimates obviously would have to be for growth even in excess of that to pay for some of these other plans, absent serious cuts. Did you want to just touch on that briefly,
Well,
Heather?
I mean, I think that this is one where, we tried in the 2000s cutting taxes at the top in ways that are kind of similar to some of these proposals. These are taking it to the next level. And we didn't actually see the kind of growth that was promised. So this is one of those places where I think, when you invest and you see past performance should not indicate, what's going to happen to you. It does seem like we could look back over history and say, wow, well, times where we lowered taxes for people at the top and lowered the corporate, did these sorts of changes, actually in the 2000s wasn't followed by the kind of strong, stable economic growth that we wanted to see. So I think we should be approaching all of this with a much bigger grain of salt, I would respectfully offer, than just what our econometric models may or may not be showing, because it seems like we sold the American public a bill of goods, and we have incomes today that are back where they were when I was in college, and we didn't actually do that, and that was sold in large part on cutting taxes at the very top and a deregulatory environment for finance, and that's. I think we lose that history if we sort of say, well, no, there's these magic numbers, but we're not actually going to look at what happened in the past.
All right, let's try to go to another question. Sir in the bluish tie right there, glasses.
Senator Hatch is said to be working on a corporate integration plan, so this is kind of off of the campaign discussion, but I'd like to know the panel's thoughts on corporate integration, kind of addressing differences between the cost of equity and debt financing, and other thoughts on changing the way that we tax dividends. Thanks.
Anybody want to take that up?
Yeah, I understand that Senator Hatch made that speech yesterday that gave some hope that there might still be a possibility, which I'd be interested in what Mr. Brady has to say about that there's still some possibility. But on the integration, I think what he's getting at is exactly what we were talking about earlier, and that is as it relates to how to reduce those increase corporate, reduce corporate rates at the same time of maybe integrating, so that maybe one way to do this to handle the pass-throughs is to allow for some sort of integration on the not paying, having to pay the taxes on dividends, some way of managing it. Bottom line, just cut to the chase, I think this is all good to have this discussion. I think if last time I checked, there were about 41 days before the conventions this summer. I think this is not going to happen in this session of Congress.
The only thing I would add is, and this is a bit of a critique of the Rubio plan, which we haven't really gotten into so much, is that I obviously think not just revenue neutrality, but revenue positiveness is important. But I also don't want a tax change that's going to exacerbate inequality. So I think the thing is that you should try to hold after-tax inequality constant, not worsen it. And I think once you start taking taxes on investment income down to zero, you have a real problem there. It's really hard to maintain, and you can see that in the TPC tables, even for the Rubio plan, although it's not the worst.
Right, and then just to be clear, Rubio does eliminate taxes on investment income, which is a pretty radical notion as campaign notions go. Another thing that we're not quite talking about there.
I would just pick up and echo a point, not the point that Jared just made, but a point that he made earlier on the tax treatment of interest. I think that there are interesting ideas. I've written about this in the past, whether it's to eliminate it, as some of the candidates have suggested, or to limit the deductibility of interest. Is as part of a comprehensive business tax reform, I think we can create more neutral taxes on new investment and mitigate the disparity between debt financing and equity financing. I think that's a very interesting idea in this context.
Great. I see other hands. Joe back there.
Hi, Joe Minerick from the Committee for Economic Development. The question for Senator Sanders, and I wonder if I could ask the panel to reflect on this. One question you could ask Senator Sanders would be identical to the question that was asked by P.T. Barnum in an old story, when an individual talked about, he asked for $1 million for an act, and the act, he said, was going to be that he would walk to the center of the center ring and blow his brains out. And P.T. Barnum's question was, what do you do for an encore? And for Senator Sanders, you've used up all your ammunition to not quite pay for all of your spending proposals. And with all respect to Jared a moment ago, we had the debt to GDP ratio stabilized at too high a level for a nanosecond, at which point we recognized all those temporary tax cuts that we knew we never were going to manage to repeal. We now have the debt rising from too high a level, and per Len and his colleagues, rising pretty soon, fairly rapidly. We're just really wasting a lot of time talking about proposals that we cannot possibly justify given the problems that we've got in the baseline, arguably.
My only quick point, and I want to get out of the way and let others take this, is that I think if we're going to have a good discussion about that, I think you need to more heavily weigh some of the advances we've made in terms of slowing the growth of healthcare costs. I think that's actually providing more fiscal oxygen than your rap that you just gave suggests, and it's something we need to build off of.
Well, and I guess Senator Sanders, if I can now channel my inner Bernie in addition to my inner Donald, would say that his health care plan would arguably, well, he argues, would build on that even further and create even more space for all of that magnificent spending. I do have to say it is pretty refreshing in a campaign year to see a candidate not only proposing massive tax increases, but acknowledging just straightforwardly for the first time, I guess, since maybe 1984, Mondale, thank you, I have a little senior moment there, that everybody is going to have to pay more in taxes, and I wonder if that's just a sort of flash in the pan or a kind of lingering effect of a salutary effect of campaign discussion.
Well, it's amazing because he's doing that, and yet he's being, people seem to like it. right? I mean, he hasn't been
His
boozed.
people seem to
Yeah,
like
his
it.
people,
Yeah.
but I mean, I think some people.
some
But I mean, I
people.
think the fact that he's giving, Clinton a run for her money on and running on raising Americans' taxes to address inequality seems kind of. I mean, we should be talking about that. That's kind of stunning. I mean, we haven't done that ever. I mean, in my, we haven't done that in a really long time. So I think it does beg the question. And I think your question actually hit the nail on the head, because we're up here talking about taxes, which is taking the American people's money for what? And you said, well, Sanders, you can't do that because we can't afford to spend. Sanders out there saying we need to make these investments in America and we all need to come together and pay for it. That's the key argument that he's making, which is a very different argument than we're going to give all the money back to the rich people because they're going to create jobs. I mean, that's like, in a nutshell, kind of
Why are
where
you
I
looking at
see.
me?
But I don't know, because you're at the other end of the table. I don't know. I'm not actually looking at you. But I mean, those seem to be the two axes of the debate. And I think, it does seem like people are really struggling with those two very different visions of what makes America grow. And this is actually the funnest campaign season ever, because we're actually having that conversation. So
We've had this, I'm old enough to have gotten clean for Gene, and, if you might recall, and George McGovern.
McCarthy.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, see?
Heather, you may now leave the stage.
yeah, exactly. Gosh, that was embarrassing.
Didn't you know you were a king? And I guess
Just not because you embarrassed yourself, just because you made the rest of us feel old.
if he wants to if he wants to increase taxes $13 trillion, I think he'd have a better selling with his people if he sold it on the basis that either tax me now or tax me in the future, because the level of debt we're going to have is a transfer of tax to the future generations, and that's the current generation that's getting screwed if we don't do something about reducing the debt.
it's
And
a
if he puts it all on debt reduction, I'd be happy.
That would be a little hard for him to do,
Yes,
given his
yeah.
massive expansion of Social
Yeah, I
Security
understand.
for everybody as well.
Right.
Additional questions, and I would like to say, as the moderator's prerogative, I am looking for some women raising their hands in this room, because I don't want to get criticized for only calling on men. And you know who I'm looking at there, Joanne, right here. And then I'm going to you, Joanne, no matter what. Yes, sir.
Thank you. One of the intriguing aspects about Mr. Trump's plan is the amount of the standard deduction, which I believe is around $25,000. He would increase it to $25,000. I'd be kind of curious if there are any revenue numbers with respect to if he would choose to raise it to $50,000, what that particular number might be in terms of helping out the middle class or those that are lesser than the middle class.
I can touch on that.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So current law is 6 and 12, and he proposes to quadruple it to 25 and 50, roughly speaking. Some of the other candidates have talked about doubling the standard deduction. Doubling it is probably about $100 billion a year. I guess the numbers are probably in the TPC analysis, but my estimate, doubling it is probably about $100 billion a year. I think it's an interesting piece. I mean, it's a piece that a number of the Republican candidates have latched onto. It's a simplification, right? It's taking people off of the income tax rolls that continue to pay other taxes, of course, and it's not only a simplification in the sense you don't have to keep track of all your deductions, but it takes a big bite into a lot of the distortions that some tax economists have talked about. In particular, you've seen a number of candidates who say, I want to broaden the base, but I want to protect mortgage and charity, and I want to double or quadruple the standard deduction. Well, if you're doubling or quadrupling the standard deduction, how many people are going to be claiming the mortgage interest deduction, right? A lot less, right? I mean, if you're taking the mortgage interest deduction, you're itemizing, and if you're dramatically increasing the standard deduction, you're cutting the number of itemizers in half or more. So it does have both a simplification perspective impact as well, targeted middle class tax relief, and it affects the consequences or the distortions imposed by some of the itemized deductions.
Okay, we have time, I think, for one more question. Joanne? Not to put too much pressure on you.
That's okay. You also know me as Joe, so thanks. It's a great panel. I teach economics over at GW. We're doing tax policy. And I have to say, I mean, I've got, 35, 25 and under. And if I'm out there on the campaign trail, I say, who do I want to cheer for? The person giving me a gigantic tax cut or the person with the fantasy of a gigantic tax increase? I mean, if we have fantasy economics, why does it matter?
Economics,
that sounds like a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess the only answer, I think your question speaks for itself. The only answer I give, and this relates to something I think Heather was getting at, is that to the extent that supporters of Bernie Sanders are hearing something they like, it's less, I'm going to increase your taxes, and it's more, you're going to get free college, and your healthcare costs are going to go down. So it's not like the tax cuts are somehow disembodied from what they pay for, in the minds of, I think, voters. I'm just trying to get inside the heads of the people you asked us to try to get inside the heads of.
And, all right, we should wrap up here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, please join me in thanking
panel. Thank
Ruth for a
you.
great job. And